Welcome everyone to this beautiful, amazing auditorium, and welcome everyone who is joining online for this discussion on how to prepare for the AI whistleblowers. So thank you to all our panelists for being here, and I'm very happy to moderate this exciting conversation. My name is Delphine Halgand-Mishra, and I'm the Executive Director of the Signals Network. So for those who don't know us, the Signals Network is a non-profit organization that supports your sources, that supports the whistleblowers who provide information to the journalists. So we provide protection to the sources, to the whistleblowers, before publication, at the time of publication, and after publication, in some cases, for years after publication. We provide legal support, psychological support, sometimes safe housing, sometimes online security support, and so on and so on. You will hear more about our work thanks to Jennifer Gibson, who is my colleague and the legal director at the Signals Network. And basically, Jennifer and her team are the ones who receive every day calls from journalists and whistleblowers who need help because they are revealing public interest information. And when I'm talking about calls, I'm talking about a lot of calls. On average, Jennifer and her team receive 2 new requests of support a week. So, as we are all here talking and focusing on AI, apparently it's a big hype this year at Peruja. Of course, we thought it was important to focus on the people who will provide this information on AI, because there's definitely one thing that will not change, is that I'm certain that what we will know tomorrow about what's going on in AI company will come from insiders, from whistleblowers. So I'm very happy to have with us 2 of the most, I think, important tech whistleblowers of these past years, whose revelation had huge impact in the world. So thank you, Tyler, thank you, Frances, for being here. And I will first go to you, Tyler. So as many of the audience know, you are one of the main whistleblowers who worked with then Wall Street Journal journalist John Carreiro to reveal what was really going on at Theranos. When you blew the whistle, you were 22 years old. So more than 10 years later, Elizabeth Holmes has been sentenced, is now in jail. So in 10 years, you learned a lot about the whistleblowing journey. And I want to jump in immediately into concrete. It's like, what would you like to say to the future tech AI whistleblowers? What are your advice for them?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I think, first of all, I would say that the role of whistleblowers is going to be extremely important when it comes to technologies like AI, because I think that the more advanced technologies become, there almost is this greater asymmetry of information between the companies that provide those technologies and whoever is on the other end, the user, the patient. And in order to expose that asymmetry of information, it takes someone with special knowledge of what's actually happening on the inside. And to take a very concrete example, in medicine or in diagnostics, when the FDA clears a diagnostic or they approve a drug, they are mostly relying on information given to them by the companies. They mostly review data. The FDA does not do third-party validation independently of these companies. So they're really trusting that the data they're getting is correct and accurate and was done according to good scientific method. And if it's not, it really requires someone who was in the company who understood what was happening to blow the whistle on something like that. And I see AI being very analogous, where if you use an LLM, for instance, and you give it a task or you ask it a question, the answer that you get may seem fairly straightforward, but the amount of data training that went into that, of processing that went into that, there are going to be biases that you're completely unaware of. And if you just assume that everything you're given is true and accurate, you could end up becoming misled. And it will take someone at the companies to really have a deep understanding of how these things work in order to make sure that AI, which will become perhaps the biggest voice in the echo chamber of the internet, is actually steering society in the right direction. So I think the role of whistleblowers will be extremely important. And then the other thing I would really want whistleblowers to know is that you don't have to do it alone. And that's the biggest mistake that I made, is I operated completely in a vacuum. I got in touch with the lawyer way too late. I really did not seek advice. I was almost like reacting to situations as they happened. I didn't think of myself as a whistleblower. And really, I truly wish that the Signals network existed back then. It actually didn't exist 10 years ago when I started blowing the whistle. But it is extremely helpful to get connected to financial aid, or to free legal counsel, or to psychological help, or to the correct reporters. There is a lot of support for whistleblowers, including internal government whistleblowing channels that you can get protection from. So there is actually a lot of help available to whistleblowers. So my main piece of advice is to actively seek that help.
Well, thank you, Tyler. So, and for those who want to hear more about Tyler's story and on your whistleblowing journey, I highly recommend your audiobook that is available on the Audible, because it's really amazing to hear your journey through your own voice. And so, Frances, your turn, if I may say. So, again, no need to introduce you. You are the whistleblower behind the Facebook files. Huge impact. You worked with Jeff Horowitz at the Wall Street Journal. And you continue to work on social media and its role in society. Again, I highly recommend your book, The Power of One, to hear your version of this whistleblowing journey. And I have the same question, but what advice would you have for the next whistleblower? Because your whistleblowing journey seemed so planned, so well scheduled. So I really would like to hear the advice you have for the next whistleblowers on what they should do. But also, I would like you to give advice to the journalists on how they should work with whistleblowers.
That's such a huge scope. I was all ready for the journalism comment. The advice I always give whistleblowers is it's a variant on what you said of, like, you don't have to go it alone. One of the things that really shocked me when I started engaging with help, which also was perhaps later in the game that I should have, was I got this very peculiar compliment over and over again. Like, basically every conversation I have with my lawyers, the first like 3 or 4 times, was they would go, "You are so stable." And I was raised to be polite, and so when you get a compliment, even if you're uncomfortable, there's only one correct answer, which is thank you. But you let it go. And what I discovered over time was whistleblowers get traumatized by their experience, right? Most whistleblowers go it alone. Most journalists do not refer people for help because they're afraid, like, a lawyer will get between them and the scoop, or the lawyer will scare off the potential whistleblower, which is part of the reason why I actually am a very big proponent of the Signals network, because the Signals network is in a different set of incentives than referring to someone to an individual attorney, because they don't work on a contingency basis. So they're not in a position of just maximizing the return on investment of that client. But because people go it alone for so long, they have to hold secrets that often end up, that are sometimes about people's lives are on the line. Like in my case, I was really worried about ethnic violence and all the people who don't speak, say, the top 20 languages in the world being left behind with the most dangerous version of Facebook. And so I always tell whistleblowers, you have to find one person in your life that you can be honest with. Like, it can be a parent, it can be a partner, it can be a lawyer. But you have to have someone you can talk to, because the process by which, when you begin to suspect something is wrong, this is even before you decide to blow the whistle, you are likely going to get gaslit by your own organization. Like, other people in the organization would not continue to do the behaviors they're doing if they thought they were wrong. Like, people have these very elaborate stories about why this has to be the way it is. And that dissonance, like believing people's lives are at risk and being told sometimes fantastical stories, that really wears down people. For me, I lived with my parents, so I had that, but not everyone has it, and it really damages whistleblowers. But for journalists, the thing I want to really, really, really emphasize is that journalists are going to be essential in this coming wave of our transition to an AI economy, because that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about going from a tangible economy where you can buy a car and crash test it independently. You can buy that bottle of water and determine that the plastic is unsafe. When you move more and more of our economy to an intangible space, the only thing and we might all get different experiences of the product even. We are left to assess the safety of these things on the marketing messages of these companies. And like Taylor said, when we are moving into experimental technologies, and that's what we're dealing with AI, you can't get a graduate degree on these systems. You have to learn these new spaces at the companies because they're literally the ones inventing them. And so it's going to be even more important for journalists to be cultivating relationships with people at tech companies long before they're even thinking about blowing the whistle. Because one of the most essential jobs you will provide is context on how the outside world views these things, right? If you think in terms of your funnel towards how do you generate a whistleblower, as like long before someone's even saying, I'm really worried about this, just saying, are you cultivating friendships with technologists? I think that's important because you can sit there and be like, hey, have you ever thought that's a little weird, right? Inside of Facebook, because we were all people who, like the people who actually built these technologies, they were all from very privileged backgrounds. You know, they didn't have, a lot of people didn't have context on how these technologies were being perceived externally. Or in the case of kids, like I never thought about the impact of kids on kids until Jeff asked me about it, right? Because I don't have children who are teenagers. The vast majority of people who work at Facebook don't have a kid over the age of 10, right? So journalists are essential for starting that conversation, providing context, and making it possible so we then can even pass the laws that will get us the information in a more sustainable way in the future.
Thank you, Frances, and thank you, Tyler. We'll come back to you because I want to get you to talk more about the journalist-whistleblower relationship. But I want now to turn to Billy. So Billy Perigo, you are a tech investigative reporter at Time, and you had countless exclusives on AI and tech these past few years. And we know each other well because we worked on one of these together. You came to the Signals Network a few months before the publication of one of your big story, and we provided support to one of your main sources, Daniel Motog. It was about the working condition of content moderators, Facebook content moderators in Africa. And we continue to provide support to Daniel today. And last week you published another AI exclusive, if I may say, on Google workers' revolt over the Israel AI deal. So that's why I thought you would be a great addition to this panel. So as the journalist covering tech, covering AI, how is it different to cover AI? Is it even different? How is it to work with AI whistleblowers? Is it different? And just before you answer, I just want to say personally, actually, please don't change anything because you are the example of journalists who care about their sources, who work so professionally on your journalist work, and we mention you as an example of journalists. So, but still, I want to hear your thoughts on how you see it working with so many tech and AI whistleblowers.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, firstly. The tech industry wants us to think that AI is a kind of categorically different technology to, you know, social media and the other forms of tech that have come before. But really, if you look at the potential whistleblowers that we're talking about, it's largely the same people. It's people who work at these companies, which are often, as Frances can attest to, they're a broad church of people who, many of whom care about the safety of their products, who care about the people who are using these products, and who often disagree with the tech CEOs who are advocating for them, the products themselves, to be released into the world, sometimes before they're ready. And so, from that perspective, there's really no difference. The potential whistleblowers are going to be the people who care about the safety and who, you know, don't agree with the decisions of the companies. To the point that Tyler was making before about as technologies become more and more complex, the kind of people who have the knowledge gets thinner and thinner. I mean, that's true. One story that I did a year or so ago was about the Kenyans who detoxified ChatGPT for OpenAI, who had to read through this traumatic content scraped from the internet, describing murders, rapes, suicides, self-harm. And many of those workers, in fact, all of those workers, didn't know that the labeling that they were doing was contributing ultimately to ChatGPT until I told them. And that speaks to how this work is being chopped up, turned into atomized, turned into little pieces of work that are then farmed out to various outsourcing companies. And so the tech company at the top of the funnel has all of the information, but often in those cases, the workers themselves don't know. So that's kind of one thing that as a tech journalist you can come in and realize, oh, connecting the dots. That required obviously having sourcing in the same outsourcing company that was doing the work that the story I worked with the Signals Network was for, which, I mean, I can talk about that because really it shows the vital work that the Signals Network does. Daniel Motown was a content moderator for Facebook, much the same as the ChatGPT ones, except watching videos of murders, etc., pictures. And that work leaves you deeply, deeply psychologically traumatized. So, I mean, I'm dealing with a source here who can't necessarily give his informed consent to be a source in this story. And that was very much front of mind for me when I'm deciding, you know, this is obviously going to change his life. It's a story that, you know, feasibly could antagonize a very powerful company. And he is, by the way, living in poverty in South Africa. So there's this huge power differential there. And yet, as many of you will know, as a journalist, you can't really overstep the line with a source where you're saying, oh, I can pay for a therapist, oh, I can give you legal advice, because you can't. Your incentives get in the way of that. So the Signals Network, what it can do, and what I phoned up Delphine to basically ask her to do, is be an independent middle ground there who can give, pay for a lawyer, for example, to give legal advice to the source, and give Daniel, in that case, the much required psychosocial support that he, I believe, is still receiving 2 years on. And so, yeah, I mean, it requires a degree of, you know, being willing to have the possibility of the source turning around and taking a lawyer's advice to not give you the story, but we're talking about things that matter a lot more than whether a journalist gets a scoop. So yeah, the Signals Network were indispensable for that story.
Well, thank you, Billy, very much.
Yeah, and I would just quickly add to that, that I almost think it's the responsibility of a journalist to help their source in that way, because oftentimes, I would say the journalist is going to understand the risks that whistleblower is taking actually better than the whistleblower themselves, just because you've studied it, you've seen it more often. And so to have resources at your fingertips that you can help this source with, I think is very important. And unfortunately, I think a lot of times journalists almost allow their sources to walk into landmines so they can get the story. But hopefully, you're able to get the story and then also say, hey, let's step around this and maybe not blow up your whole life. And you can get, I think both can happen.
And I want to just accentuate something that Billy said, which is, you know, there is, I totally get the hesitation for journalists to referring them to another party, because like you, right now you have that relationship, you know, it might evaporate if another party gets involved. And part of why the only group I will refer people to, and a lot of people reach out to me, is the Signals Network. And the reason for that is, you know, Delphine has a background in journalism. She understands the value of whistleblowers, of journalism, and you want to work with a party that wants to help figure out how do we balance risk and potentially creatively navigate it. And so please don't be afraid to ask for help.
Yeah, I would just add very briefly that
not to glow at you too much. Yeah.
The whistleblowers are speaking to you for a reason. They want to get the story out there. They've kind of made that calculation before they even answer your message. So, you know, in Daniel's case as well, I told him, like, are you sure you want to do this? And he was like, hell yeah. So, yeah.
And But thank you for all these points. I think it's very useful to highlight them. And I want to also a way to go to Jennifer to say that when we talk about the protection of the whistleblowers, we of course talk about the protection of the individual, but actually the protection of the individual goes and is very linked to the impact of the story. So a lot of the journalists and whistleblowers we worked with and provided protection, actually we help amplify the impact, because then when you have, for example, a senator tweeting about the whistleblower just 1 hour after the story goes out, it protects the whistleblower, but it's also help start public debate and so on. So I think a lot of journalists who work with us also realize that we protect their individual sources so they can focus on the journalist's work, but we actually help the story to have more impact because the journalist cannot become the PR person of their own story. So that's a good introduction to Jennifer, who, as I said, is a US attorney and who leads our whistleblower protection program. So that's your everyday, to talk to journalists, to talk to whistleblowers, to make sure that the story goes out in the safest way for the whistleblower. And I want to go to you. You worked with whistleblowers from the shrimp industry, from the tech industry, from AI. What do you see every day as the new threat for the AI whistleblowers, the new threats, but also maybe new opportunities for whistleblowers to come forward?
Thanks, Delphine. Hi, everyone. So I want to really quickly pick up on something you guys said, which is because you're all journalists in the room, there's not a single whistleblower you're going to deal with that's not traumatized. So Frances's comment about she kept being told she was very put together, all of them are traumatized. If they're not traumatized by what they're blowing the whistle on, they're traumatized by the process of blowing the whistle. And I think it's really important to understand that and just verbalize it, because we talk a lot about trauma-informed reporting, and yet I talk to journalists who are dealing with whistleblowers and they don't seem to understand that the whistleblower they're dealing with is traumatized. And so it's really important as you're dealing with whistleblowers, whether they're tech or otherwise, that you start from a starting point of, this is almost certainly an individual who's experiencing a form of trauma when I'm speaking to them. When it comes to AI, I think, look, there was a report out this week by All Tech is Human, which said that they're seeing a chilling effect among sources in the tech industry. They're worried about retaliation, they're worried about surveillance, they're worried about their jobs. They're not speaking out in the same way they were speaking out a few years ago. That's going to get worse with AI. The ability of employers to surveil their employees, the ability of employers to use predictive analysis to try to predict which of their employees are going to be talking to journalists, or which of their employees are accessing things they shouldn't be accessing, or are just behaving in unusual ways, is going to become easier and easier and probably more flawed in many ways. But that means the sources you're dealing with, and we're already seeing it, are finding it harder and harder to get information out, at the same time that disinformation means reporters, the first thing you ask me is, where's the documentation? Where are the hard proof of what they're saying? And so the risks are necessarily going to go up, but that also means the support they're going to need is going to go up. And the benefit of the current AI interest is that there is interest. So the strategies for protecting these whistleblowers at the moment are probably going to be limited legally, but there are potentially lots of opportunities to put in place what I call the kind of pseudo-legal strategies, which is, how do you get attention on the case? How do you get attention on the case quickly? And how do you show the companies that there are people paying attention? And that's going to mean not waiting until publication and something goes wrong, but working with the source before publication to say, okay, when this comes out, who do we immediately need engaged on the story? Which politicians do we need talking about it? Which elements of civil society do we need engaged on the story? And what other support mechanisms are we going to be able to put in place? The other thing it's going to mean is for the whistleblowers who aren't going public, you know, Tyler and Francis both went public. For every public whistleblower, there's dozens who don't go public.
Or
and
hundreds.
you know this as journalists, these are, you know, most of your sources want to remain anonymous. They don't want to blow up their life. But those actually are the ones in some ways who need as much, if not more, support, because in order to remain anonymous, they need someone to talk to. And their biggest risk is actually the isolation that comes from talking anonymously and not having someone to consult, not having someone to talk to, not having someone to say, hey, my employer just did this. Am I paranoid, or do they know it's me? And so it then becomes, I think, as we move more and more into surveillance kind of mode, for that kind of protection to exist and support to exist for the whistleblowers, so they feel safe continuing to talk to the journalists, and they don't pause halfway through and say it's just gotten too risky. So, you know, there's challenges coming, but I think there's also opportunity in terms of the interest, and I think also opportunity in terms of advocacy around whistleblowing protection that makes it easier for you guys to get sources, which is we shouldn't be talking about AI regulation without putting in place better protection for whistleblowers. The reality is we don't understand what comes out of the black box unless it's someone on the inside telling us. And so a starting point on AI regulation and AI tech accountability, full stop, needs to start with how do we get information out, and that has to start with how do we protect the people who are risking everything to get that information out.
To highlight something really quick, I'm just jumping in the United States, if you are at a privately held company, and all these big AI companies are privately held and will be for 10 plus years, right? The time to going public is getting longer and longer and longer. There aren't whistleblower protections. Yeah. So we say the US has whistleblower protections. For these critical companies, there are none.
No, but thank you, Jennifer, for highlighting so many important points. I think it is really truly important to remind that 99.999% of the whistleblowers are traumatized, even if they look so put together. And the psychological support is so part of the conversation, and the point about the need for better whistleblower protection if we're talking about regulation. So thank you.
For context, I lived with a priest for 6 months while I was doing my whistleblow. So like, this is not a frequent accommodation.
So I want to open to questions very quickly. Okay, I wanted to maybe go another round. If there was more you wanted to add on what journalists should be aware of, but okay, let's start to take questions. Please.
We can repeat the question also about, so.
Yeah. Okay, hi.
Thanks for this fascinating talk. Big fan of all of your works, and a lot of us operate outside of the US. My understanding, for example, Mr. Schultz, is that you had to pay a lot of money in legal fees. In parts of the world where we work, some of the consequences are jail time, deportation, other things like that. Do you have any advice for these countries where the rule of law doesn't really apply?
Thank you. I might turn to Jennifer, who leads our whistleblower protection program.
So we do support whistleblowers. We support globally. So we've got whistleblowers currently in very insecure environments, the kind you're talking about where the law is more likely to be used against you than as a form of protection, and where the risks are potentially life or death. In those contexts, part of what I'm doing at the moment is spending a lot of time advocating with the human rights defenders world to say, these are your human rights defenders. These whistleblowers are, in these contexts, human rights defenders. They need to be treated that way. You need to work with journalists and groups like us to figure out how we get them out safely, how we enable the stories to go forward without putting their lives at risk, and what support you put in place. It's not easy, and it's not possible in every context, right? So the way we work at the moment is we work closely with the journalists to figure out, okay, what's possible in the context. We've worked with a network of organizations to try to get a visa to get someone out of a country before the story ran. We've been able to provide relocation expenses, and also we have a fund, so worth everyone knowing. If you've got a whistleblower who needs a safe phone, an air-gapped laptop, a safe house, or legal fees in another context, there's a fund that we can use to tap into. It's not as big as I want it to be. It's not as big as it's needed for in the US, but it is there, and it helps. And it can be used for things like, and it was in Daniel's case, living expenses. So in contexts like Daniel, the content moderator we were talking about, he lost his job. He couldn't eat. So we were able to give him a living stipend to get him through for a few months, and then work to get him a fellowship so that he's more stable and able to work. In another context, we're working with a donor to facilitate a monthly stipend for a whistleblower so that the story can move forward while we work to set up a longer-term solution for that individual. So the strategies are different because of the high risks, and it can't be done in every context, right? It's got to be a very individualized approach.
And just one point to give you a sense. So last year we received 102 requests of support. 50% were US, 50% were rest of the world, and 1/3 were tech, something like that. So.
And to emphasize like this fund, right? When I was in the process of trying to decide whether or not to work with Jeff, like I was actively working on hunting spies. Like I was like a threatened researcher. And so like in my mind, I was like probably overly threat aware. And I was like, oh my God, like I don't want to buy a burner phone because like I'm like in a pretty high level of paranoia. And he had to go to the ethics board at the Wall Street Journal about a $60 burner phone. Right, and in the end, he just paid for it out of pocket, which I hope doesn't get him in trouble. But it's one of these things where if he had known that he could have gone to you guys and been like, hey, you know, I have this source, and like the thing that is going to make or break her participation is this, like it would have been really helpful.
Other question? Yes.
Yeah, a question for Billy. What if AI can detect whistleblowers in the future? So we are in the company has an AI who detects the whistleblowers. Do you see any danger in this?
I think we need to be careful about not falling for some of the hype that these companies spin about their technology. They would quite like us to think, obviously, that they have this magical all-knowing technology around the corner, which is really a public narrative that they're spinning in order to get people to invest more money into the large costs of making this technology. There are predictive systems that exist currently, but they're only as good as the input information that they have, right? So then you have to ask, what are the inputs? And really, it takes us back to the kinds of cybersecurity and operational security advice that you would always give to both journalists and their sources, which is use Signal, don't Google things that you don't want Google, the company, to know, for example, if you're reporting on Google, as I do. You know, try to be aware of what metadata trails you're leaving on the internet. And it's complicated. Like, it requires having an understanding of how the computational infrastructure that sits behind these shiny interfaces that we all use day to day, how that works. And not everybody has that. But like, I just caution against the idea that these tech companies are all-knowing and will be able to use AI to detect whistleblowers anytime soon. Because if you are, you know, making sure that your communications are secure, then there is actually often very little that these companies can do to detect that these whistleblowers are, in fact, the sources of this information. So, I mean, just another example, Francis took photos of, I mean, Francis, do you want to?
Well, I was about to say, I have like 10 pages in my memoir where I talk about like, so like, what are the operational trade-offs for a company between secrecy and performance, right? So a fundamental trade-off that companies have to weigh is between, like, you can run a secure facility. The Department of Defense has lots of contractors where you cannot bring your laptop home, you get searched every day. Like, there's ways to keep secrets. But those processes cost huge amounts of money to execute, and they cost you in talent, right? The highest quality talent will not work at a company in Silicon Valley where they can't bring their laptop home, right? They will not tolerate missing their bus because they got searched, right? Or the line for the X-ray to leave is too long, right? They're just not going to. And so there are these trade-offs that exist. And so you can go read through it. There's probably 10 pages in there about, like, what about time of day? What about this? What about this? The main advice I would give to people is try to continue to behave as similarly to how you did before, right? So I took pictures of my screen because then there was no paper trail that I was printing or I was downloading. Like, you probably leave tabs open as you go through your workday. Like, you know, accumulate your tabs, photograph them when you get home. I don't know. But try to stay behaving as similar to other people, because then the operational costs of catching you will destroy performance of the company. They just can't be that precise.
So there's many resources that I want to highlight before we finish, but one is really linked to that point, which is the AI chapter that the AP tech reporter Garance Burke wrote for the AP style book, and I would highly recommend any of you who wants to report on AI to look at it, and because there's a lot of very good advice in this AI chapter of the AP style book, but many points are, it's still journalism, so it's still the same basic question. Focus on, is it really working? Who are the humans building this tool? And so on and so on.
The Pulitzer Center has a lot of great resources for that as well, for AI reporting, that is worth taking a look at.
Any other questions?
On this already a bit, but why...
Sorry, I don't see where is the person.
Here.
Ah, there, okay, thank you.
So I'm just wondering, why do journalists and the public have to rely on tech whistleblowers in particular? Is there really such a big difference to other industries? And a second question, if I may, if we have to rely on tech whistleblowers in particular, doesn't that show a flaw in the system? Are there any regulations or policies that have to be pushed more so that we need them less?
Thank you, great question.
No, I think whistleblowers can be anywhere, absolutely. But I think in tech, you especially have this problem of the black box. At Theranos, it was both a literal and a figurative black box. We had a black box that nobody knew what was happening inside, except for a relatively few number of people. For something like an AI company, it is very much a figurative black box, where there are very, very few people who truly and deeply understand how that black box is working. And so we really are relying on that small number of people to make really good decisions about what they do with the information that they have.
I would build off that in one way, which is, I talked about before the idea we're transitioning from a tangible economy to an intangible economy. And the first wave of that intangible economy was not big tech, it was finance, right? Like, finance does all kinds of stuff behind the curtain, and sometimes it trashes the economy. And we correctly responded by saying, hey, you guys over and over again, very clearly don't know how to behave. We need to have systemic checks so we can monitor as we go along. And occasionally we realize those checks aren't strong enough and we have to make them stronger because they crash the economy again. But we need to extend that kind of level of skepticism, or of saying, hey, you are in a different power differential than other industries are. You need different systematic rules. And we just haven't gotten to that place yet, because like Billy said before, they've tried to sell us this line that they're different. Like, they're special, they're full of primary colors and like free lunches, and like they're not a threat. And we need to acknowledge any industry that is, or that any system that is that powerful needs to have checks and balances.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the conversations at this festival have been about, how news can sustain itself in a world where the tech companies are profiting off it, and we're unable to fund the expensive task of investigative journalism. And that's happening because of the huge power differential between the tech companies and the entire economy that relies on them to communicate now. And so, to your point, it sucks that we have to rely on tech whistleblowers more and more. Like, it's convenient for me as a tech journalist, but like, I'd prefer to live in a world where, information was a lot more transparent. And you asked about regulation. There are lots of regulations being considered right now about how to deal with tech and deal with AI. And if those regulations can mandate transparency and actually mandate whistleblower protections as well, that will go a long way to helping us know a lot more about how the systems that we're increasingly relying on work.
Yeah, I would just say, but the reason we're even having a debate about tech regulation is because of tech whistleblowers. Without the whistleblowers, there wouldn't have been a debate because nobody knew what was going on. And it was the whistleblowers who came out and said, it's not all as rosy as they want you to believe. So in an ideal world, companies are transparent and government regulates as it should, and nobody has to risk anything, including their livelihood, to protect all of us. But I think what increasingly happens in these spaces where power goes unchecked is that the check comes from inside and someone risking a lot to make sure that the people on the outside know what's happening.
And I want to give a little ray of sunshine there. Like, it feels really dystopian. It's like, God, how did we let it get this bad? But the reality is, like, this is what we do. We humans invent things, and they blow up, and then we do something about it. And we are just, unfortunately, in the middle of that moment. And so this is not different than the past. This is just like, we need to put our big boy pants on and, like, do the adult thing and pass some laws, and we can make it work.
Thank you.
Yes, Draco. Second, the gentleman on, yes, you. Sorry.
Is it on? Just something that is my nightmare. How do you protect yourself from fake whistleblowers?
What a great question.
So we worked with journalists who assess the whistleblowers' documents and the public interest of the information the whistleblowers bring. We are not, at the Signals Network, we are not a WikiLeaks publishing what seems right to us. We work with media and with parliaments who are the one assessing the public interest value and the value of the information of the whistleblowers.
Well,
and then we protect the source. But sorry, if the question was for
yeah, I mean, it's the task of the journalist, right? It's the same as you would vet any other source, whether they're a whistleblower or not. Whistleblower is a fuzzy term, really. But you ask for documents, you ask for corroborating information, you obviously make sure that they work for the company that they say they work for. You have to warn them in advance, like, I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive on you just so that you're aware, because lots of people don't expect that. But you have to do your due diligence, and if you get it wrong, it backfires on your reputation as a journalist, which is incentive enough to do your homework on that.
There's a common trick in Silicon Valley, which is that when you interview people, there are a lot of people in Silicon Valley who put very grandiose things on their resumes, or like they claim very impressive things about themselves. So what do you do? Like, you're about to hire this person and they claim they're God. So the trick is you ask them to explain something that they worked on, and then you just keep asking more questions. And people who are lying very rapidly can no longer explain the work that they do. And so it's one of these things where if someone comes to you and their story sounds too good to be true, you can play dumb, and that is actually one of the most effective things you can do.
You can't ever rely on a single source, though. You need to, from a journalistic perspective, you need corroborative sources, whether that's other people who work at the same company who can confirm details that aren't publicly known, or other online open source stuff. Yeah.
Yes, another question in the middle of the room.
Is it me? Yes. Okay, this is a question to Billy. Did you ever have a situation where you thought that a source might hope for like a personal benefit of talking to you, and was that sort of a thin line to walk, or could you just talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, you need to make that assessment for everybody that you talk to, whether they're anonymous or not. But when they're anonymous, it's more pressing because what they tell you might, go out in the media and not come back to them necessarily. But I think it requires an understanding that everybody who is a source for a journalist has an incentive. And all that you can do as a journalist is to make sure that you understand that incentive as perfectly as you can and try and ensure that whatever they're trying to do doesn't, raise any red flags with you about their credibility. It's impossible to kind of look for a source who doesn't have a reason to be talking to you. So you just need to work with those incentives and try and understand them as best you can. Obviously, there are people who try and put information in the press tactically for their own reasons. It's an entire industry. You need to be aware of that for sure.
I just want to highlight a few resources, and then I will go for a last round before we close. I just want to highlight the Peruja Principles that were prepared here a few years ago, and that are very important guidance for how journalists should work with whistleblowers. And I also want to highlight Billy's newsletter, and I also want to highlight the Tech Worker Handbook that the Signals Network worked on for US, UK, and Ireland, who are basically what journalists should send to their sources, so the sources can think of the right thing, of what are their risks and options. So the Signals Network, Worker Handbook, Peruja Principle, AP Style Book on AI, and now the last round of things you wanted to say. Go, Tyler.
Yeah, just to quickly comment on the previous discussion, you can also ask a source who else they've been talking to. At least in my case, first I talked to my managers, then I talked to the CEO, I talked to the president, I talked to the COO, I talked to a board member, I talked to regulators. I talked to literally anybody who would listen, and the last person I ever wanted to talk to was a reporter. And it turns out that it wasn't until I spoke to a reporter that anything happened. Once the reporter knew about it and started acting on it, then change started to happen. But as a reporter, if you have a source who's gone and barked up every other tree, you can say, well, what did they say? You have email exchanges with the CEO. What did the CEO say? What did that board member say? What did that regulator say when you reached out to them? And that's how you start piecing together the puzzle.
And it's how you prove that they are who they say they are as well, because if they can give you the receipts, then yeah. I would say that, look, as a journalist, you can't exclusively rely on whistleblowers. Whistleblowers are one piece of the puzzle. You need to be talking to people in these companies. You need to be talking to people around the, academics, etc. But we're living in a world now where, as you guys have said, the costs there's a chilling effect, firstly, on whistleblowing. There's, it's becoming a lot harder to do this effectively, and the price that you have to pay if, a big company or whoever, or an authoritarian state comes after you is very high. And so I guess I would say organizations like the Signals Network are vital, and if you have any spare money lying around, if you're one of the big funders for these kinds of things, I think it would be money well spent, personally.
Thank you, Billy. Frances, your last word.
I want to acknowledge, we should, when I came forward, I had a fairly high expectation that Facebook would not come after me. Like, the way I assessed the risks was Facebook had a huge PR problem already, and I was talking about really serious things. They had never sued anyone before. They had a huge amount of attention on them. Much as TikTok does more responsible things around kids than, say, Meta does today, that's because they have a lot of negative attention on them. I think part of why you got sued is, not a ton of people had heard of the company before. It was big in the biotech industry, but they didn't have the profile where they feared going after an employee. And one of the things that I think is very different about the environment that your whistleblowers are going to be operating in is the economy is much more balkanized. And those individual companies may not fear going after an employee as much as Facebook. Facebook actively considered going after me. There's been a bunch of sources that have talked to journalists that said they came real close and people talked them off the ledge. They're like, this is too dangerous. I don't think that's true for a lot of AI companies. So please be careful with your sources. If you've had bad experiences with people going to lawyers before, there's a difference between talking to someone who doesn't have a financial interest and someone who does have a financial interest. But if you don't let your source talk to a lawyer early, at least in the US, they may never be able to get a lawyer in the future. Because I've had a couple of friends who worked with certain journalists, and because they didn't file with the SEC, and remember, filing with the SEC, it can stay silent for 5 years, right? The SEC moves very slowly. They often don't act. But because they didn't have a claim on file, they couldn't get contingency legal services at any point kind of down the road. So please at least have a long think on it, because it is the responsible thing to do.
Thank you. Jennifer, your last word.
Yeah, we're out of time, so I'm just going to say, if you've got a source, call us. We will try to help. It is so much easier to help your whistleblowing sources pre-publication than post-publication, and I can give you a really good example that I'm dealing with right now, where I've got a client who's facing contempt charges, where we weren't brought in when the journalists worked with them, and now that person cannot share the rest of the information that the journalist didn't realize they were sitting on with anyone, because to do so, they'd be in violation of a court order. So please, please think about both what Frances said, but generally, your sources need more than just legal support. They're gonna need a lot more. They're gonna need psychological support. They're gonna probably need some security guidance. Stuff Billy was talking about sounds really simple if you're a journalist dealing with it every day. If you're a whistleblower who's very panicked, you know, things like metadata can create all kinds of confusion. So please give us a ring. We will try to help if we can.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Billy. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Frances. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you to all of you. And we're here to continue the conversation backstage. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You guys are not funny.